Explain like I'm 5. Why do file names use underscores? What is wrong with just using a space? Others have pointed out nice reasons. But there is also the web aspect, which sees space as 20, so linking can be ugly. You can use a space. The problem is when you try to access the file with a command line. It will interpret the file name as ending at the space, so it'll error out. 95 of it comes from what other folks mentioned: spaces require extra work when using command line tools, which are still extremely common in software development and systems administration. The remaining part is probably that file name validation is often done using a language called regular expression matching, and handling spaces require extra work there too. Conversely, underscores are by default considered part of the word character class W, which includes letters, numbers and underscores. Spaces break programs as an example. Let's say your file name is explain it like I'm 5. When many programs look for the file, it will try to open a file named explain. Even now, it's backwards coding to accommodate for spaces. Spaces are a default delimiter in almost every coding language. A delimiter is something that separates words. So, when you write code, you have to make a special accommodation to include spaces in words. It's a holdover from older operating systems like MS-DOS that did not support spaces in file names. Keeping no spaces just makes life easier, so you don't have to surround them with quotes. I'd like to add on. In online file storage systems, like SharePoint, you can use spaces for file names. The problem is there's a limit to the length that a URL can space is converted to 20. The URL encoding for a space. So every space in your file name actually takes up 3 characters instead of 1, and this can really add up when you're looking at relatively short URL limits and a user base that likes to store things in nested folders. When you try to type a link for a file in a document in an email or script, it looks something like this. Server share my doc. If you had a space in the name of the document in an email or script, it would only see server share my, because computers stopped recognizing the link at the first space. Some systems example URLs don't support spaces. So spaces are changed into underscores, which is easier to read. They don't need to with any modern file system. Old file systems like FAT16 used before Windows 95 had a limitation of 8 characters with no spaces. Windows 95 introduced a new file system called FAT32, which has much fewer restrictions. I believe you're allowed up to 256 characters. File names with no spaces or special characters are more portable. They can be moved between computers that use different operating systems. Sometimes you will see a URL with 20, which is the URL equivalent of space. It happens when the file name has a space in it. It works, but looks ugly. In programming, there is what is called white space, usually line breaks, spaces, and tab stops. These are used to structure text. Now, if you want to write a program that deals with files, you ideally want the file name to be one word. So a piece of text that isn't structured itself but just a single string. Otherwise, you will have to explicitly declare parts of the text to be treated differently. This is why many style guides will ask you to use file names without whitespace. This comes from the days when the only interfaces were command line. So if you wanted to access a file, you had to type out its whole name. But spaces are usually used to separate arguments for command line programs, so spaces in file names were problematic. However, it's been the case for decades now that you can use spaces in file names on Windows and such. And if you need to do something with it on the command line, you just put the entire file name in quotes. Like this. Copy this C. Some characters have a special meaning. Most computers use a space to split instructions apart. A bit like words in a sentence. If you use a space in a file name, you have to always remember to tell the computer to treat it differently, which you can easily forget to do, leading to mistakes. It can also make things harder to read. Using another character simply avoids these problems. The underscore became a popular alternative. It wasn't used for much else, and keeps text easy to read. There's no technical reason to choose it. You could use any other character that does not have special meaning. Command line arguments are traditionally space separated. You execute a program like this. Argument 1, argument 2, etc. File name is one argument. But if a file name has one space in it, you have a problem, because then it reads as two arguments. You can solve it by wrapping it in escape characters. Backquote some file backquote reads as one argument because it's in quotes. But some shitty and buggy software doesn't handle that properly, and then things don't work. Simple solution is to just not have spaces in file names. File names can have spaces. In what context are you referring to? Because space is usually read by computers as 20, which needs to be swapped with space when presented to a human. Using an underscore solves the issue by breaking the file name into human-readable parts. But it is a single word for programming. You got great answers that explain some of the problems. Let me add another. Programming languages with few, if any, exceptions don't allow spaces in a variable names, so developers get out of the habit of using them too. Though some prefer camel case rather than snake case, but that comes down to convention and preference. You can use spaces in file names and folder names, but it isn't recommended. Older command line tools like the command prompt or the MS-DOS operating system didn't support spaces in file names because it used spaces to identify the different commands and variables in syntax. Net use userver home username, for example. The spaces separate the commands and variables. If you include a space in the name, it will break the command and you have to use quotes to force the CMD prompt to add the space to the file name. Net use userver home Bob Unger. Most programs don't like spaces between file names because you also use spaces when declaring functions or commands, so it messes it up. Space is already used to separate instructions, so it needs to be used only by instructions, not file names. Well, for a long time you couldn't use a space. That's only in newer Win95 and later OSes. Some of us just have habits that don't die, lol. A computer can't see. It can't comprehend what you are telling it to do. A computer has rules how to interpret a command, and usually space means a breaking point in a command. Do something OTHERTHING. We use loud space to keep the file name as one element. So this doesn't happen. Do something other thing. Some operating systems don't allow spaces. Some do. Some commands understand spaces. Some don't. This ambiguity which cause a lot of headaches if you are not mindful about your command elements. Real answer is computers aren't magic. For decades spaces have been used to break up messages. Think about how we use spaces in our sentences. It's like that.